I said, I mean, thank you all for joining us in this. Just by way of some background, in one online debate, we got accused of being Johnny-come-latelys who were just opportunistically latching onto this debate. I could only say in response to that, I mean, precariousness has been a labour market theme of mine ever since my PhD. It was on hospital working practices and the use of casual employees, and over the years that's morphed into a varying concern around things like temporary agency work or dependent contractors and now the gig economy. And so when it came to writing about this, of course, our concern around the utility of a basic income grew out of a notion, not so much of the fact that people may have low wages or the need for an adequate income, but the issue that came to light with us, of course, and trying to conceptualise it, was the nature of the labour market that we have in the UK, with its a large proportion of low wage people. For us, that the concern was more around precariousness and I think arbitrary precarity, the fact that you can, for a sizable body of the workforce, which we'll get onto, you could have a certain standard of living, a certain income, but that could be removed at the flick of a switch. And so I suppose in terms of Covid-19 being a vast exogenous shock, one maybe could model that in terms of a form of market failure, because the exogenous shock of a pandemic is a huge social cost on society. And if you have an itinerant flexible workforce, to use that parlance, who can be easily dismissed, what recourse to a standard of living do they have in the absence of huge state intervention? And I suppose that's what COVID has done in that sense. And we kind of hope that this would serve as a catalyst to rethinking the utility of the concept. But we can come on to that, in the discussion and so on later. And so in terms of the paper, which, happy to send to you, alternatively, you can see it on our website there. We sort of do make the case in some detail about how you try and cost a comprehensive, a fairly generous basic income. But in terms of this presentation today, I'll kick off. I'll talk about the two themes that we've tried to pick up on here that have sort of coalesced in this perfect storm, if you like, in the UK. One, hollowing out of the state over the last 10 years. And then the second, within that time, until this point in time, the government liked to crow about having record low rates of unemployment. Well, yes, but that's only been achieved through, the growth of a precarious workforce in the last 10 years, as typified by the increase in the so-called self-employed. And then, the perfect storm, if you like, then with COVID-19 coming into the frame. And then I'll hand over to David, who will talk around the issues on the basic income, and then introduce sort of our thoughts and our approach in terms of that. But I think I will say at this point, though, the debate around the affordability of a basic income is a complete canard. It is affordable, and it's affordable at levels comparable with the new state pension of about £9,000 a year. We think easily so. Of course, you might well say with a UBI or a basic income, the principle is to get it established, and then you might worry about tinkering with the levels afterwards. In formulating these arguments, we're cognizant of the work of Compass and other authors like yourself, Guy, and people like Howard Reed and Stuart Lansley and so on. And there's there's considerable debate there in how you sell a basic income. Is it affordable? But we think it is, and we think you can sell it at a fairly generous level. So next slide, please, David. Yeah, my eyesight's not very good, but I think what you draw from that chart there is when you look at government spending in real terms over the last 10 years, I think the first thing to draw from this is that one particular category of individuals have done quite well under the present regime, and that's OAPs, basically. The government wouldn't be cynical of me to say have clearly recognised who their core voters are, and one of the points there is that the elderly are growing as a proportion of the population. So it's it's a chunk of the population that most turn out and vote. It's increased in size. It has considerable power. So in terms of spending, that particular group have been well maintained, and of course the orange line there is spending in real terms on the NHS. Coincidentally enough, spending in some way associated with the elderly has been maintained, if not increased. Now, what's happened there?
Sorry, I got a notification and I tried to.
Whereas spending in real terms on other services provision, you know, the clear trend there in the last 10 years has been down. Of course, post-crisis, there was a high there, but one of the most remarkable things about this chart is that as a society gets wealthier, coming out of a recession and so on, and you expect demand to increase as we get wealthy, you would think that spending would go up. A very crass, well not crass, a very brutal interpretation of this chart would be that the elderly have been funded, their income in that sense has been maintained and increased here, whereas on the opposite end of the age spectrum, when it comes to children, you know, you've seen a decline in spend in real terms. And then I think another point to draw out of this is the unevenness of these spending cuts in spatial terms and in terms of the arms of government. You know, in terms of austerity, if we want to use that word, and I will, you know, there's been a huge disproportionate impact on local authorities, of course. You know, if we take Birmingham City Council as an example, you know, from conversations we had with one senior economic officer there, I think, you know, they casually threw into the conversation that their income in real terms have been cut by about 50% over the last 10 years. You know, and it's councils, of course, who have to disproportionately provide the duty of care, if you like, in terms of things like social services. So they, of course, in this current environment, have a limited ability to provide things for care like the elderly. If you're poor, you know, if you can't afford to pay for your own care, then the standard you're going to get is rather minimal. You know, if you've been living in a council flat and you don't have your own home to sell to pay for your elderly care, you're then in a very stringent means-tested system. So this is what we've seen in the last 10 years in government spending. I would call it almost an intergenerational transfer, but from the young to the old. You know? And coincidentally enough, that same dichotomy is witnessed in the Brexit vote as well, isn't it? But one unavoidable consequence of all that, of course, is that even despite the ring-fence spending on the NHS and the state pension, once you go past 2010, what is remarkable here, although in some ways not surprising, is this huge drop over the last 10 years in terms of the increase in life expectancy. You know, for an advanced economy to be having this kind of plateauing out of life expectancy, when historically the trend was for it to go up, it is a rather harsh testimony to the impact of these spending cuts. Because, yeah, I mean, the state pension has been increased, but services around it, you know, not to put too fine a point on it, have been, well, I don't want to say collapsing, but I'll stop short of saying that, but you get my point. So this is the first backdrop that we have. You know, this to me reiterates the utility and the necessity for a basic income, because I'll come back to that. Stan, thanks for the comment there. We'll come back to questions afterwards. The second element here, of course, is that the growth of a precarious workforce. I mean, I come back to the point, 4% unemployment means very little when, you know, the disproportionate elements of jobs growth in the last 10 years have been in the form of self-employment, 0 hours contracts, forms of work associated with the gig economy. And I think in terms of looking at the nature of the UK workforce, you know, there some points stand out here, I think. You have about 8 million people who've been with their current employer for less than 2 years continuous service. So that the coalition government back in, was it 2012 or 2013, I can't quite remember, increased the qualifying period for unfair dismissal protection from 1 year to 2 years, because they've you know, become concerned by the increase in tribunal applications over the course of the 90s and noughties. You've got about 1/3 of the workforce there who've been in service with their current employer for less than 2 years. So they don't qualify for unfair dismissal protection. So there's an element of arbitrariness in terms of their being losing their job. You know, we have another 1.5 million people here who were out of employment in the previous 12 months. So that can affect some degree of eligibility for certain forms of job seeker allowance, for example. But I suppose the point with them typically is last on, first off. So if you think of Jaguar Land Rover and utilising agency workers in a recessionary context or a pandemic context, these people are typically the first to lose their jobs, so to speak. I can't quite read that, David, so I'm going to default to my own presentation there and blow it up. Yeah, I mean, in terms of 0 hours contracts, of course, we have about 700,000 people there. Dependent contractors, those people who only have one client in effect, what whom you might well refer to as surrogate, well, sham self-employed or surrogate employee, if you like, another 800,000. Now, what concerned us here in terms of these people with the volatility of their earnings or their exposure to somewhat arbitrary dismissal from work was those who had dependents here, and we're defining dependents here with children under the age of 19, run into several million, as you can see there. So for us, another reason there for the essential utility of a basic income revolves around just the nature of this workforce, this precarious workforce, which we would say is about a third of the workforce in the UK, who of course also have dependents. So it's not just an issue of you losing your job, it's also those who depend on you in terms of your family. So next slide, please, David. So enter COVID-19, of course, and I think the essential issue with forms of employment that lack basic benefits such as adequate sick pay, and I say adequate sick pay as opposed to statutory sick pay, which is on a par with universal credit. It's not really enough to live on if you have a family. In a world turned upside down, we don't want a situation where people caught in a pandemic are having to work in order to eat. And we see this with the self-employed. And despite the fact that the Chancellor, was able to announce a generous degree of wage subsidy through furloughing approximately 9 million people now, which is staggering in itself. Basically 1/3 of the employed workforce in this country are furloughed. That left out, the self-employed, because the schemes to announce support there was still dependent on having been in, having had your business submit a tax return so you could assess your income. Many of those have been missed out by government response. But we want to discourage work in a pandemic through simple explanations such as, well, if you go to work with an illness, you spread it to everybody else. So there are also sound economic efficiency arguments, as well as concern for human welfare about ensuring that people don't act as a vector to spread a negative externality all over the place. It's as simple as that. So basic income eliminates these issues, and in contrast to the current benefit system, when you remove the contingency element of means testing people's eligibility, you also remove an admin cost, which is about 1 or 2 billion a year. You get rid of that straight away. So, in terms of shoring people up, it's a good pandemic response, whereas of course the current benefit system with universal credit, with the 5-week wait period before you get your first payment, for people who lack savings, that's a particular problem, isn't it? So bringing in a basic income eliminates that issue. But of course, and to come back to the essential point about precarity, traditional income protection schemes, respond very poorly to that, in terms of just the way the universal credit is structured, the way it, try to mean test people's income. You can't really insulate against fragility of earnings, if you then try and do an estimate of people's previous earnings and so on. And therefore, I think one of the key things that COVID has done until now in terms of this debate of the affordability of a basic income, is that the vast government borrowing that we've seen challenges, I think, and will change public perceptions around what is affordable and increase the political space then for innovation. And I think we're certainly seeing that with this government. I think what has been remarkable so far is the degree to which conversations of the sort that people such as George Osborne try to throw into the mix, but we have to pay for this, so we're going to have to return to spending restraint, have been absent at senior government levels. Johnson himself says austerity is not a word he recognises now. To what extent that holds up as we go forward remains to be seen. But we certainly think, that there is an opportunity here, as Mariana Mazzucato, for example, has pointed out, this does provide an opportunity, we think, to reshape capitalism. So, next slide. I'll hand over to you, David.
Thank you, Alex. So, this point I just want to sort of briefly go over, and I think Alex has already mentioned a lot of it. is a basic income desirable? Is it something that we want to make a fundamental permanent feature of the system, of the tax and benefit system? To which we fairly quickly concluded, yes, absolutely it is. For starters, the current system and any traditional income protection system is to a certain degree inefficient. There are administrative, there's a deadweight loss there. There's a cost to running such schemes. There's an administrative burden. Once you have a basic income set up whereby you make a payment to all, you lose all of that. You no longer have to deal with that. You no longer need to assess what's your eligibility for this. Do you fulfill the criteria? Have you been looking for work for 35 hours in the last week? You know, aside from all the moral issues, we also see there's a huge potential for administrative savings, and there's a deadweight loss to running existing systems. And we can design that out by using a UBI. Secondly, the current system is prone to holes. That's a huge problem in the current pandemic, as Alex has alluded to. I've seen estimates that there are about 1 million people who are missed out of various government schemes through one way or another. That's obviously an issue right now because a number of these people are going to be desperate to work to eat, thereby increasing the risk of transmission. But more broadly, the social safety net that we have has holes in it. And however much you try and design that out, and however successful you are at designing that out, however much you change criteria, you're always going to face the same problem, which is either that you are designing a system where you have tight eligibility criteria that need to be carefully policed, in which case you're going to miss people. You're going to have people that have that, as we've seen with the current system, you're going to have people that have died due to inability to properly claim, or you're going to have a system where you get huge numbers of freeloaders, essentially. At which point, why not move to a basic income system that removes all of these perverse incentives? You know, the current incentives, the incentives of existing schemes are absurd. In terms of experimental evidence, there are others who are much more au fait with this literature than I am. But I point out the recent Finnish example. Every example I've seen suggests that for recipients, a basic income is welfare enhancing. And it's particularly welfare enhancing for those on the bottom end of the income scale. So all of the experimental evidence that I've seen and I've read about suggests that it's welfare enhancing. We'll leave aside the labour market issues for a moment, but it certainly has the evidence is becoming overwhelming that it boosts welfare at the bottom of the income scale. We propose to use basic income to render the current system more progressive, and I'll outline in the next slide exactly how and why that works. But one of the things that becomes apparent when you look at this in some depth is that most tax and benefit systems can be broadly recreated, if you like, or broadly modelled as basic income plus a series of marginal tax rates. The difference with existing systems all over the world is this notion of eligibility, this notion of conditionality. And that's not conditionality attached to income, that's conditionality that's attached very specifically to your behaviour or something to do with you, whether that's age or more likely whether it's your choices in terms of going out seeking work, your life choices. So that is the distinction between a basic income and a not basic income, if that makes sense. In terms of the labour market impact, it's difficult to ascertain, particularly for the very low and the very high paid. At the moment, we put quite perverse incentives in place for the low paid. We tax them at they have extremely high effective marginal tax rates because of the withdrawal of benefits. That's true in any benefit system that I'm aware of around the globe. It's not just a British thing. You know, you might argue that ours is worse than most. You might argue that you could redesign it, but that's true of any benefit system that I've seen. For middle income earners, there's going to be a negative effect. The income and the substitution effects operate in the same direction. That's a concern. I think that concern has probably been overplayed in many quarters. but I think that's definitely something to watch, and that's something that we would need to have quite a clear handle on moving forward if we were to implement this in a practical sense. For the high paid, again, I think many of these issues are overplayed. You'd see an increase in taxation, an increase in overall taxation, and you didn't see an increase in their marginal rates. So you'd get income and substitution effects again operating in different directions. Difficult to know what would be the impact on their labour force participation. It's unlikely they'd give up work. Finally, consider the alternatives from a moral perspective. If you introduce a contingent scheme, as we have, and as is used around the globe, then if you choose not to fulfill the criteria that the scheme lays out, if you choose not to spend 35 hours seeking work because of any reason, then your payments are reduced. So what are we effectively saying? Are we effectively saying that in the event that you don't fulfill the conditionality that we've put in place, you deserve to starve? Because, to be blunt, that appears to me to be the upshot of the current system, that in the absence of an effective carrot for working, with marginal tax rates as high as 75%, effective marginal tax rates as high as 75%, we need a very, very big stick, and that's it. So we now look at the feasibility, and there's a lot of discussion on this in the paper, but I think fundamentally the affordability debate is a cannot. It's a nonsense. And the reason for this is because, as I say, you can model an existing systems as some form of UBI plus conditionality. And once you do this, it makes the alternatives look bizarre. You know, the UK has a very, very strange set of effective marginal tax rates once you model its benefit system as a UBI plus conditionality. You end up with a payment, i.e. universal credit. That payment seems to depend in an arbitrary manner depending on where you live. It varies according to various other things, including the choices you make, but also including the situation in which you happen to find yourself. Your income between £0 and about £9,500 is taxed at 63%. Your income between £9,500 and £12,500 is taxed at something in the region of 70%, and your income above that is taxed at about effective rate of about 75%, at least up to the point where universal credit's withdrawn, and then your marginal tax rates drop. This is a very, very odd system where your highest effective marginal tax rates are being levied on the lowest earners in society. The first portion of your income has extraordinarily high effective marginal tax rates because of the withdrawal of means-tested benefits. That seems wrong. It's bizarre. So existing systems are bizarre, and once you take that into consideration, once you model that properly, then you find that in many regards this debate about affordability simply doesn't exist, because all you're doing is shifting the payment from the first £15,000 of income further up the income scale. You're spreading it out over the income scale so that you pay a greater proportion of this payment at much, much higher levels of income. So we modeled a series of tax and benefits changes that would include the payment of a UBI. We set it at the rate at which a single person would be allowed universal credit in Birmingham as an average cost area to live. It's about £8,500 per annum. So we modeled that, and we found that that would be affordable, that you would be shifting effective marginal taxes up the wage curve, and we would also have a number of other taxes, particularly additional taxes on wealth. And that's an important point, because you can introduce a land value tax that would go a substantial way to offsetting the cost of a basic income. And a land value tax is a brilliant tax because it's non-distortionary. It's the only tax that I know of that is non-distortionary, that has zero distorting impact on incentives. The question is, how high can you set it before you you reach problems. But even at modest levels, you can raise a lot of money that goes a decent way to offsetting the cost of a UBI. Finally, many countries, including the United Kingdom, already effectively pay a UBI to certain portions of their society. We do it inconsistently and inefficiently, but we do pay it. Pensioners receive an effective UBI. Why? Because if you don't receive state pension, then you receive pension credit. And in that case, in any event, whatever your choices through the course of your life as regards work, you're guaranteed a certain minimum level of income. Now that minimum level of income might be very low, but it is guaranteed. So that has all the hallmarks of an effective basic income for a certain portion of society, but not others. Child benefit is another that is paid to all parents, leaving aside the small number of very high earners. It's paid to all parents, irrespective of anything you do. You know, you receive child benefit for your first 2 children. The personal allowance for higher earners, and only for those earning over £12,500, functions in exactly the same way. It's identical to having a £3,000-ish basic income and paying tax on your entire income instead of having the first 12.5 grand tax-free. You know, so we have these elements of a UBI in place, but they're not applied consistently. So finally, in the paper, we talk a little bit about dealing with the politics, and this is an area where it would be great to have, I think, further engagement, further feedback. The something for nothing argument gets a lot of people. I remember having this argument with a friend and colleague as a graduate student. It's a moral issue for many. It's not even an economic issue. They dislike the notion of something for nothing. If we pay people something, they'll just sit on their backsides all day. I think that's not true for most of us, partly because there's still an incentive to get out and work. You want to augment your income. Just because you're given something to begin with doesn't mean that you don't want to augment your income. And of course, the element of there's tax rises. There's the tax rises to pay for it. That's an inevitability. It's difficult to argue with the former. That's really, to my mind, a question of morals. If people have good ideas, then that would be great to hear. I would point out that the NHS is also something for nothing. You don't need to have made contributions. You don't even need to have made national insurance contributions in order to be eligible for the NHS. If my son becomes ill, then he will receive care. He hasn't paid for it, but he will receive care. And that's true of all of us, certainly who are citizens, and many who are not. So it already exists as a benefit in kind. Pension credit, similarly. Inheritance is also something for nothing. Are we going to impose 100% inheritance taxes? It might be nice, but it's not going to happen. So a partial solution that we came up is taper the UBI as income rises. And this is really, really interesting because this is effectively exactly the same thing as increasing marginal taxes for certain groups. If you taper your income, your basic income as your income increases, that's exactly the same as increasing your tax rates. But it's politically much more sellable. I don't understand why that is, but that's because I'm a nerd. The broad point is that people have much lower levels of antipathy to something that's withdrawn as your wages increase, and it also gets rid of the argument that the rich benefit, than they do to exactly the same payments made via, say, a 50% tax rate. And I find that fascinating. It's got to have a psychological reason somehow, but it avoids the bad politics of raising the standard rate of income tax. So that sort of just sums up what we've been over. That sums up sort of why the pandemic is such an apposite moment to introduce such a scheme. And I really open the floor to questions. Thank you.
Okay. I think Stan had a comment under the chat there. Maybe we'll just have a look at that first while anyone else thinks of questions.
Alex, my point about Birmingham City Council is not really important. But thank you for this for the thought you've given here.
Can I say to the others that we've been good sparring partners for the last 25 years. It was Stan who brought me to the UK, incidentally, folks.
Yes, from Newcastle, Australia.
Yeah.
We gave you a telephone interview. And
2 in the morning local time it was.
You were your usual aggressive self, but that didn't put us off.
No.
And we were right, because you've proved to be a brilliant choice. But,
thank you.
Where does I've got a couple of thoughts. Where would a negative income tax argument fit in here? I mean, that's got very good credentials.
Yes, Milton Friedman certainly was an exponent of it.
And so is Charles Murray. There's lots of right-wing thought which goes in favour of the negative income tax, including mine. But first of all, there's that, and that would feed in with David's idea of making the universal basic income taxable, which I think would be essential. My second thought is we have a lot of other ways of helping the poor. We've got, and I wonder how your universal basic income idea would fit in with those. First of all, we have housing benefit. That's very important, often ignored. But if you don't want to think of housing benefit, you can think of social housing. That's very important for many people as a component of their income. And then fitting in with that, there's the child tax credit and the working tax credit. I'm not sure if those are the current names. Is it family tax? But the alternative to what you and David are arguing is that my preferred alternative would be to have a wage subsidy, rather like the working tax credit, which I think would help, which I think could help. So there are those two ideas: the negative income, and how would your scheme fit in with the very complex system that we already have for helping the poor?
I'll let David tackle that one. We did talk about it briefly in the paper, and we do acknowledge that. And I suppose that there is an important point here, is that the detractors of this form of income support always think it's just a left-wing idea. But as you pointed out, Stan, with the negative income tax, there's on the opposite end of the political spectrum, it's a right-wing idea. Yeah, I mean, if the Adam Smith Institute of all places, have espoused it in certain fashions. But David, I'll pass over to you on the point about the housing benefit and the wage subsidy.
No, just to briefly deal with those 2 points in terms. Negative income tax, I have no issue with that. There's conceptually no distinction between negative income tax and UBI. You can model the two. The two can be modeled to provide exactly the same overall payments to individuals and the same effective marginal tax rates. So negative income tax, as long as it's payable to all, irrespective of your labour market status, there is no distinction between a NIT and a UBI. It's just the political framing. If that sells better, I have no problem doing it.
Well, then you better use that term.
Sorry?
You better use that term, David.
You
want to sell, don't you?
Sorry?
But the point is, we want to have the rich taxed. We don't want people like you and Alex getting a basic income. You mustn't get it.
No, we effectively tackle that point, Stan, by advocating a taper out, so that in effect would have the same effect.
Use the negative income tax framework within which to put that. Then you don't have to have this taper rubbish. It's a negative income tax. There's a vast literature on it, David. You're a nerd, self-confessed. Start reading that.
I'm aware of the negative income tax arguments. The issue is that it's mathematically identical. The two are mathematically identical.
It's a better term because it's got the tax component. We don't want Alex to get any basic income. He's far too rich for that.
Can we move on to the point around things like housing benefits?
Yes.
Yeah, and I know Guy wants to.
The terminology, Stan, I accept that.
Cool. I know Guy wants to make a point here as well. So if I just deal with the benefits issue, and then hand over Guy to the point you make, is that okay? You've got time for that, I hope. So in terms of dealing with the existing benefit system, my issue here is that it's not. It loses on both counters. It's not effective in the sense it's not universal, right? The problem with that, the issue with that, is that you always end up with holes. You know, you end up with waiting lists for social housing. You end up with people who are trapped in renting places that are unsuitable due to the nature of housing benefit payments. Housing benefit is a particularly nasty one. Because the payment depends on where you live. So you actually have an incentive, you lack an incentive to move to a cheaper part of the world. It seems bizarre that someone a few miles south from me would receive a greater payment solely because they live in a more salubrious area, but that's how it works. It's bizarre, it's nonsense. So housing benefit is a nasty construct in that sense, and it's far better.
Would you propose to do away with it, David?
Yes, do away with it. Do away with housing benefit.
Yeah.
It costs 23 billion. It did a few years.
And that's
expenditures.
So you abolish that, but you replace it with a UBI, which has much better incentives, much nicer incentives.
It's a revolution that you're proposing.
Yes, it is.
Pretty much.
It's the same with working tax credits and child tax credits. So the issue there is the rate at which they're withdrawn. And that, in effect, means that the poor pay very high rates of marginal tax as those benefits are withdrawn. Again, they spread that over a larger portion of the income scale. So again, they would be replaced if you permit the terminology by a UBI. So Guy, if I can just hand over to your comment, because you were going to say something.
Yeah. Listening to you both from the perspective of someone who's been working on this for 40 years, you can imagine I had a lot of reactions. But let me just deal with this negative income tax first. A negative income tax is not, repeat, not the same as a basic income. And Milton Friedman, with whom we had prolonged debates within Bien, some years ago, gradually came round to admitting that, and he joined the Basic Income Earth Network. A negative income tax has been proposed, and it's a family basis. It's not an individual basis. By definition, it has to be paid after the income period. In other words, you have to calculate whether a person receives a bonus, a payment, or they pay a tax. And that depends on the end of the year. So you're not actually paying the amount. And the person who is covered by a negative income tax would not know in advance how much he's going to get. He just wouldn't know, okay? He won't know until the end of the year and the calculations have been done. Whereas a basic income is paid individually, it's paid as an economic right, so that you as a legal resident citizen or a legal migrant receive the basic income per month. You know in advance what you're getting, and you know it's non-withdrawable, and it gives you basic security, which is a key objective. To me, they're quite different concepts. The wage subsidy idea is bad labor economics, just bad labor economics. As it happens, I was invited to write a piece on this in the Financial Times last month, and I wrote a critique of the wage subsidy furlough scheme, saying that it's going to be subject to huge deadweight, huge fraud, and total inefficiencies, and will block labor mobility from sectors where there's a labor surplus. You're paying people not to work. It's a crazy scheme. And they won't move because they're getting 80% of what they were getting when they were doing their labor. And then the Telegraph asked me to write another piece last week. I never expected to write an article in the Daily Telegraph. And I've had huge response from people saying, yeah, you're absolutely right. At least 1/3 of the people receiving the furlough job retention subsidy are actually working. It's a complete fraud. So 3 million people, according to recent research, are getting this wage subsidy for doing nothing or for continuing to do their income earning job. It's a scam, it's a boondoggle, but over £60 billion already have been spent on this scheme. Imagine if we'd used it for a basic income, you could have spread it all around. Well, this scheme is incredibly regressive. It's giving £2,000 a month to a high income earner and £400 to the precariat, and hardly anything to the people who are relying on a universal credit. It's a regressive scheme. It encourages inefficiency, and I believe it's lowering output, directly lowering output. But that aside, I just wanted to make a few points because I think you can sharpen your own paper in this regard.
Yeah.
The hollowing out of the state is the argument you've got there is partly due to the privatization under austerity, incredible privatization. I think you should incorporate. I've written a book called Plunder of the Commons, where I've shown how, in fact, that's taken place. And it is increased insecurity and increased inequality, which is two of the giants that we should be combating through a basic income. The next thing, I think your life expectancy graph, very interesting. I've in my new book, Battling 8 Giants, Basic Income Now, I call stress the fourth giant, that the beverage term of giants that we need to slay with a basic income. And the main factor in your graph, which I think is a very useful graph, is this stress. Huge increase in stress due to insecurity. And a basic income would reduce stress by reducing insecurity. And I summarize in the books the large amount of evidence from experiments and pilots on basic income, and there have been at least 30, and I summarize the results. The biggest single result is the reduction in stress. And stress causes rising morbidity, rising demands on healthcare, and all the rest that goes with it, and those excess deaths. And in fact, one of the biggest problems where we should hope a basic income deals is to increase personal and society resilience. And that's the piece I've written in The Economist recently. A basic income would increase personal resilience. And in a pandemic, that is really number one priority. It must be number one priority. The next point I would like, which relates to some points I think that David was making. I agree with your poverty trap argument. In fact, I would put the percentage tax rate, the marginal tax rate, at over 80%. I mean, that's ridiculous. So basically, the poverty trap is extremely high. In other words, going from the benefits, either universal credit or the legacy benefits, you are only going to get an extra 20%. But the situation, David, is much, much worse than that. Because there is also what I've called a precarity trap. A precarity trap arises as follows, right? If you lose your job and you become unemployed, you have to wait 5 weeks. Don't count on it. You probably wait 15 weeks. But the data are out there from the DWP before you start receiving your benefits. Okay? And along comes the job center plus, however many pluses you want to give them. And they say, you've got to take this job the other side of Birmingham. It's only a temporary job. It's only a temporary job, but you've got to take it, right? You would be an idiot to take it, because not only would you face the poverty trap situation, you'd only get an extra 20%, but you could anticipate becoming unemployed again after a couple of months. And then you would be back waiting 5 more weeks, maybe 10 more weeks, Well, they check whether you lost your job for your own fault or whatever before you start receiving your benefits. So work it out over a 4-month period. Taking that temporary job, you would be out of pocket in big time, right? This is a nonsensical situation. There is no incentive. So you have to do the sanctions and you have to do all the rest of it. To me, this is the most cruel social policy you could possibly have. And it's much worse, even worse than you were correctly showing. So I think that that's the key thing. A last point I want to make, I've got lots of others, but you please look at the books because I've covered them. But emphasize that what you favor is a basic income system, not a basic income or a universal basic income. What I mean by that is to make it equitable. What you really want is equal basic security and equal basic income for everybody, which means that anybody with a disability has extra costs and a lower probability of earning an income. Therefore, they would have to have a higher basic income in order to give them an equivalent basic income security. And I think it's important for that because we have to win over the support of disability groups who think that if you introduced a basic income, you'd get rid of disability benefits and all the other benefits. That's not true. We can actually pay it as a basic income as part of a system of social protection. And other schemes you would have. You can have disability benefits, you can have housing benefits, you can have other things as well. It's not a panacea, but for me, it's important to give that sense of resilience, basic security, and it is not something for nothing because it's a return on our collective social wealth. It's a sort of social dividend. And the very people who are receiving the biggest basic income at the moment are landowners. Ian Duncan Smith, the architect of Universal Credit, receives £150,000 every year as a subsidy simply because his wife inherited 1,500 acres of land. He gets a guaranteed big basic income of £300 a week. Now, he is opposed to a basic income because he says it will be a disincentive to work. Well, how come he continues to work? He gets a guaranteed basic income, a very big one. And it is disgraceful that we are in a situation where the government has tax reliefs that come to over £430 billion a year. You talk about affordability, look at those tax reliefs. There are 1,156 of them altogether, and they are lots of somethings for nothing. So there are a lot more arguments that you can bring into your discussion. And I like the way you're going, but I think that the arguments are even stronger than you've put them. And that is good news, I think. Thank you very much for listening.
No, Guy, thank you for that feedback. That's great. Anything else, all of you as well, please send it to us. That's really good. Appreciate that. Mike, you had a comment up there. David, can you read that?
You're going to everybody. So yeah, it's okay. I'll just follow on from Guy. I absolutely nothing at all to say that I don't disagree with from Guy. It was really just to pick up on a couple of things he said and reinforce them. So he discussed the housing disability benefits at the end. We had a whole series of seminars in Scotland a couple of years ago across the universities, etc. And yeah, the conclusion was housing issues, housing challenges are separate from basic income. They exist, they have existed. We need to tackle them, but don't tackle them through a basic income. And turn David's argument his head, it's exactly because housing costs vary by place that you don't want to roll housing benefits into a basic income, into a system, as Guy's just said, yes. So you retain housing benefits to take account of the differences in housing costs in different areas, which come from different economic forces. And again, as Guy's just said, people with disabilities, with long-term conditions, need to be brought up to a level with the rest, with equal. They have those additional costs regardless of what their incomes are, and therefore disability benefits need to continue. And we found over the years that those two groups, particularly carers and those being cared for, are the most difficult to persuade, partly because they're cynical, sceptical about any change away from the very bad existing system, that anything would be even worse. And therefore you've got to debate and argue and help them through to see the benefits of the UBI. On some of the things that Guy was talking about, precariat, I did a submission to the Works and Pensions Committee yesterday, and reminded them that the Redundancy Payments Act of 1965 was to encourage people, particularly in the Midlands, to leave their jobs. There were labour shortages in the motor industry and engineering and so on, and it was to encourage people to search for new work and give them the comfort, the confidence that they would still have an income between leaving the old declining industry and getting a job in a new one. We were encouraging unemployment. We're encouraging longer job search because that's economically efficient, basic labour economics. And yet sanctions, etc., the whole approach has been you take any job as quickly as possible. That's not good for the individual, it's not good for the economy, for employers and so on. So a basic income has some elements of those original Redundancy Payments Act, which people have forgotten about. And at the current time, it would have had other benefits, which would have kept effective demand in the economy higher, it'd be an automatic stabiliser. So this idea of resilience for individuals, for communities, for the economy and so on, which would then feed through to small businesses, as Guy's described, again, is a very good argument for the universal basic income. Land value tax, yeah, nice tax, we like it, particularly in Scotland. However, you should never rely upon one income source to fund any sort of policy initiative. You run into problems. And I'll leave it there, thanks.
No, thank you.
And the other, I presume you've seen the feasibility study, the final report that came out from Scotland a couple of weeks back. There's also an economic modelling paper beside that from the Fraser Institute. Hopefully you've had a look at both of them, as well as all the other literature that is out there. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for that. Anyone else come in with comment at this point?
I can respond to a few of those. If that,
yeah, please.
If
yeah,
you're amenable to that. So I agree with a lot of what you're saying. I don't take this as a disagreement on many fundamental issues. A large, on 90% of this, I would agree. In terms of disability benefits, actually in the paper we propose retaining the disability benefits entirely separate from basic income. And the reason for that is that disability is contingent, and contingency and universality don't sit alongside each other. Disability is something that you might have for a period and then not have, or you might not have and then you do have, or it's lifelong. In any event, it's something that is contingent. I wouldn't expect Alex, for example, to receive a disability benefit because he's not disabled. So in that sense, you have to have some form of eligibility. You have to have some form of assessment. Are you disabled or not? What level of disability do you have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I would be very, very reticent about rolling that into a basic income system and it doesn't fit the definition that I gave, which is there's no contingency. It's not contingent upon your behavior. It's not contingent upon, aspects like that. So we can call it what you like. That's really just a question of terminology. What's of greater interest to me is how do we deal with it? And I think dealing with it through a system whereby those with disabilities get additional payments aside from the basic income would be my preferred solution to that. I think would be our preferred solution to that, and we raised that in the paper. We are not relying on a single source of taxation, don't worry.
No.
Land value tax was one of several. We looked at Tobin taxes, we looked at changes to marginal rates of income tax, we looked at VAT, problematic though that is because it's regressive up to a point. We looked at, what else was there? Changes in corporation tax, reversing some of the reductions in corporation tax that have occurred in recent years, etc., etc. So I would caution you that we are not proposing to put the burden of this entirely on the shoulders of one form of taxation, but it is something that we should look at. We should look at alternative sources. We did look at reducing loopholes, reducing the scope for tax avoidance. It's quite difficult to see how it's difficult to calculate with any certainty how much we would raise through those sources. It probably wouldn't be trivial, but it's because of behavior alterations. We wanted to say something. We can cost something with certainty, and then of course you'd look at doing certain other things in addition. Some of those tax breaks you'd want to keep, to be blunt, because they are designed to alter behavior, not necessarily all of them. I'll come back to you, Guy, in a minute. So that's that side of things. Housing benefit, I think we'll probably agree to disagree on this. It really, I find problematic due to some of the reasons outlined. In terms of the negative income tax, yeah, I take your point about time periods. That wasn't, yeah, you're absolutely right there that in practical terms, the two would work differently because of the timing of payments and because of the timing of assessments. So that's a genuine point of difference. I suppose my broader point was that you can devise a negative income tax that would give identical payments overall over, let's say, the course of some lifetime to a UBI plus marginal taxes. That was kind of my point. It wouldn't need to be levied on a family basis. You could levy a negative income tax on an individual basis if you so chose, although you would need to supplement that with payment for children. So that would be equivalent to a beefed up child benefit. But it would be doable. I mean, I think it's better than, I agree with you that a UBI is nice because of the timing issues. But I think a negative income tax is probably better than nothing if it's the only thing we can politically sell. I think there might have been other issues that were raised. I completely agree about redundancy and job search. I mean, universal credit is a particularly nefarious, nasty system. You know, you could eliminate a lot of those issues without going for a UBI. I think you should go for a UBI, but I think that's a slightly separate issue for quite how bad universal credit is in some of these ways. And it does create perverse incentives in terms of inefficiency. There's big efficiency issues, as you rightly point out. Alex and I had this discussion. One of the things that eats into your effective income is commuting. You know, commuting is a huge cost, and commuting is a particularly large cost as a proportion of your income if you're poor. So if you have to commute for an hour to get to a job, then you could be faced with bringing home virtually nothing after, you know, virtually nothing in addition. So you face extraordinary marginal tax rates. Cool. Alex, you're moderating, but I just thought I'd address some of those.
No, you nicely handled, David. Any other questions from anyone? Vicky, you've got your hand up. Yeah. Bring into the conversation, please.
Thank you. And that was all been very, very interesting, I have to say, and I've agreed with quite a lot of the comments that have been made since as well. And thank you, David, for clarifying some of the things. I just wanted to ask more generally, and there are two questions really. First of all, the moment you start means testing for UBI, then you might start getting into problems because quite a lot of the savings that you hope you're going to make just won't happen. So I was wondering whether, in fact, we should look at it much more across and possibly get some stuff back from the people who receive them in different ways. So that's one thought, if indeed they're already earning quite a bit. So that would be quite an interesting discussion to have at some point. But my more important question is, because I've written quite a lot about women and also people who do work that they don't get paid for. And of course, UBI would actually be a very substantial contribution to ensuring that there is proper value given to all this. Is that not a very important aspect of UBI itself? And should be really sold on that, given the huge amount of non-paid work that is done by people, and also the fact that women more generally lose out because they are carers and they only work part-time and all that sort of stuff, and therefore earn through their lifetime hugely less. And not only that, but by the time they get to pension age, as we know, they only have about a fifth of the pension wealth of a man. UBI might turn that round a bit or equalize, even though obviously the men will get something too. So what do you think about that as actually an extra reason for supporting UBI? And you may have mentioned, I may have missed it. It may have been one of the slides, but I do apologize if I have.
No, look, when we wrote this, I mean, we engaged with the work of people like Jill Rubrick. I don't know if you know of her work. I mean, Guy, you probably would have encountered her work a fair bit, but she made a comment in a piece, and she said a UBI could have deleterious effects on women's labour market participation if it reinforces their roles as carers. I mean, where I'm going with this is, I think I get that, and to be more than fair to Jill, she was a strong proponent of the minimum wage back in the day. So I don't think that's where she's necessarily coming from. I suppose her concern is more in terms of that we don't somehow, that a UBI wouldn't act as a brake on women pursuing paid, fulfilling employment. But that's a secondary argument in a sense. I think you're absolutely right, and that when we entered into this, it was the dimension that care work is not valued. It doesn't show up in GDP. And that a UBI, for all the other things it can do to promote basic security and a modicum of equality, would act to compensate on that. You know, it's a huge thing. I mean, I can't think off the top now what the value of domestic work is to the economy if you rate it at, say, £10 an hour or whatever. But yeah, it's very important. And when we did the stuff on the hollowing out of the state, we particularly looked at, what the women's budget group and these sorts of writers had said, that when you look at single mums with children who are having to work, and then yeah, I mean, the UBI is a strong tool to help, offset that, I think. So if under our scheme, if you had a sole single, a sole parent with 2 children, then the basic household income, if we give children half the adult rate, then you're approximating 20 grand. That's something significant. It'd be huge for it. Yeah, simply would.
Okay, well, one very quick thing that in relation to this incentive to work, I mean, you could just say that for the men as well, and there is no sign that women have less incentive to work than the men. In fact, very often more, because they actually need to be able. So I don't agree with her analysis.
I may be interpreting her slightly out of context.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right.
But yeah, I mean, you could turn that type of argument on its head and say, I'd encourage men to rebalance their lives more. David, did you want to chip in on a couple of the tax pointers, but we come back to Guy? I think had another question.
Yeah, I just sort of wanted to make a brief point, but I actually can't remember what had been asked. So forgive me, I've got a memory like a sieve and a young infant. So bad combination.
So, don't worry.
Let me go in.
Hi, did you have another question?
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
Please do.
Okay. Let me come back to that point, Vicky's point on women. You're listening to a man who's been strange in the sense I've been conducting basic income pilots in 4 continents over the last 20 years. And we've been giving basic incomes to men and women equally. And in every pilot that I've seen, women have benefited disproportionately more than men. Mm. And if you're giving an equal amount, of course, to men and women equally, then clearly as women have lower incomes and lower savings, it represents a small redistribution. But it also increases individual agency from women. And one of the results that have come through in a number of pilots is that a lot of women have used the fact that they have basic income security to walk out of abusive relationships. Mm. And in this pandemic situation where domestic violence has been on the rise horrendously, that is quite a freedom. And in the surveys that we've been involved in, the fact that women have left abusive relationships is in my view, a good outcome. I disagree with Jill. I mean, she's an old social democrat. She's a laborist. We've had arguments over the years. And I think that the basic income and the agency issue is quite strong. And don't forget that as far as the elderly are concerned, women receiving a basic income, not only is it a higher percentage of income for women compared to men, but women live longer on average. So then, actual fact, they continue to receive the basic income for a longer time. Now, I think the biggest question, the biggest single question, is that all forms of work should be given equal status and equal value in our society. It is a ludicrous statistical delusion that care work is regarded as non-work and doesn't get compensated. It wouldn't get covered by negative income tax or any of the other schemes, but with the basic income, it gives people the chance to relocate their time if they can, etc., etc. And to answer your question, and it's covered in my book, Battling Eight Giants, is that the value of unpaid care work in Britain has been estimated by the ONS as £1.24 trillion a year, which, for the record, is more than the total of manufacturing and all financial services put together. So here we are having a huge problem with care, we know that, and yet people providing unpaid services are not getting any basic income security. It is a disgrace. And I think one of our strongest arguments in the basic income community is saying that all forms of work should be given equal status. Full stop. And that, of course, is a feminist issue because most of the unpaid work is done by women. I think have a system where we were all encouraged to shift to spend more of our time, men and women, in care and voluntary work and community work would be a great thing. So I don't buy the argument that a basic income would reduce work. I've got a whole chapter going through the evidence from around the world of all the experiments. Listen, again, all the experiments have shown that basic income does not reduce labor or work. It actually increases it for various reasons. And in fact, when you look at it, the anti-basic income arguments that it's going to make people lazy just doesn't, the evidence is not there. It's not there. And I think we should be far more confident about that argument. It does not discourage work. That, I think, is an important, powerful argument. And I don't want to feel defensive about that at all. And on that note, I'm going to have to leave you because I've got to go and prepare for the Argentinian Congress, which will be a trial. But thank you very much for the paper. I think the debate is going to be useful. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Guy. Thanks for the comments. Yeah, really appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Any other comments, folks?
Yeah, can I just comment on a few of those things? I know Guy's had to leave, unfortunately, but hopefully other people will be able to pick up on some of my responses, if that's okay. Yeah, one great example of the impact of an effective basic income on caring is grandparents. Yeah. Grandparents receive pensions. Grandparents do not have to worry about whether undertaking caring work will mean that they cannot have a job. So actually, grandparents are a great example of what some form of unconditional payment in that sense can do to change the landscape of care. My second point was with regard to one of the other issues that Guy raised, which was, I think we need to be careful in drawing on some of the experimental evidence. I like the experiments. I like that they're done. I think it's great. I think it's absolutely fantastic that we've got some going on in Scotland. I wish the English were so enlightened, but yeah, let's leave that issue. But I think we need to be careful in drawing on that in terms of work incentives, for the simple reason that, yeah, but we're only modelling half, or we're only experimenting necessarily so with half of the issue here. We're giving people the basic income, which is wonderful, but we're not making the associated tax changes. And you do need to make some associated tax changes. So we're actually only dealing with half of the issue when it comes to incentivizing work. And I think we should be honest about that. And I don't see a problem with being honest about that. And I don't see a problem with being open about that, yeah, there's a risk. And there's a risk certainly in the middle portion of the income spectrum there's no, to my mind, there's no negative in being open about that and saying, actually, it might reduce work. It's still welfare enhancing, even if it does. It's still a good thing. And to be absolutely blunt, you could make the same argument about any other income in kind, for example, education, although that takes children away from you for the day, so maybe not. But certainly the health service, surely I would work more if I had to pay my own insurance costs for healthcare. That's not true. That doesn't seem to be something that appears in reality. So I think, we should just go for it, to be blunt.
Okay. I'm conscious of time, folks. I mean, and maybe take one more question if there is one.
Just one thought.
Yep.
To improve what you and David have proposed, I think you must make it clear that it's a taxable basic income.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, okay. Yep.
We don't want you to get it, Alex.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that. This is still the worry that that Alex might get universal basic income. Is
the way we posit in the paper, Vicky, of course, was tapering it out to tackle the affordability issue. But,
yes.
Look, I mean, we in writing that paper, we saw a trade-off between trying to sell it as a concept, and you,
of course,
in my mind, in a sense, to me, the important thing is to get it established as a concept.
I agree.
It was like the national minimum wage. It came in at a cautious level, and then you ratchet it up. So issues around, how generous should it be? What benefits should stay in place? In a sense, secondary to that. But yes, I mean, that is an important point.
Yeah. No, I agree.
Right.
Okay.
Gary mentioned BN, which is the Basic Income Earth Network, which
we've got in touch with Michael Pugh, or he got in touch with us. So yeah,
he's not BN. BN is the world one, and we're having the World Congress in Scotland next August.
Okay. Yeah.
Their definition, CBINS, which is the Scottish Basic Income Network, and so on, and almost everybody else who supports basic income concept, it is paid to everybody. It's non-withdrawable. That's key, because one of the principles is that it is for everybody. Guy went down that philosophical argument of it's a social dividend. There's lots of economic analysis around that. It's a universal basic income. Everybody gets it. Therefore, you get solidarity, build resilience. And we know from lots of other things that if the middle classes are entitled to something, it will be protected to a much greater extent than if it's just for the poor.
Yeah.
So how you pay for it is then a separate issue. And you pay for that through the tax system or whatever, or some would now argue modern monetary theory, you just issue the money. Okay, but it's non-withdrawable, it's non-conditional, it's individual, and it's paid regularly. Those are the fundamental concepts that make it basic.
I have to say that I agree, and that's why I asked. I mean, once you start putting all sorts of affordability issues, no, I don't mean affordability, I meant means testing and so on.
Conditionality, yeah.
Conditionality, you just mess it up. And so, but what this means though, is that probably at the end, you end up with a smaller amount per person, than would otherwise be the case, and you always be in danger if you're looking at affordability that it might be too small to actually make any serious impact. But nevertheless, I think the principle should be for all. So even Alex will get something.
I can't square that argument at this stage, guys. I mean, as a principle, I agree with you. I think in trying to make this sellable, we went down the route of trying to tackle this affordability issue. So yeah, I mean, we you know, I as a principle, I agree with it. As a way of trying to make this thing not, you know, sellable. I mean, I suppose that this is where we've gone down this route, but I don't have an answer to that in the sense that, yeah, I mean, you know, I would want a universal basic income. We removed the word universal because we felt that, you know, in order to sell it, you had to rigorously cost it. Not everyone is going to buy endogenous monetary theory, I'm afraid, you know, and we have a government in Westminster who, you know, a big chunk are only just champing at the bit to start scaling back state support. So it's how you play it, I don't quite know. But, you know, I think, you know, a big part of this debate is get it on the books, get it accepted by a widening chunk of the population. And then, anyway, you know, I don't have much more to say at this point, I'm afraid. But look,
well, there are loads of things going on. Yeah, there are loads of other bodies sort of pushing for this, as we've just been hearing. So I think it's important to see. I mean, obviously different societies will accept perhaps different things, but the whole discussion we had about women, the moment you start saying, well, no, her partner or potential partner, whatever it is running quite a bit, therefore the household income is above a certain amount, you've had it. You've lost completely the ability to have that impact.
We certainly avoided, you know, talking about partners' incomes or anything like that. I mean, so in that sense, the household income isn't a factor in tapering it, but
well, a lot of the talk about retire, because I've just been looking at the ONS website and the latest stuff on how incomes have risen, because you've shown that very interesting slide that showed the amount going, well, the increase in pensioners. But of course, the interesting thing is how much were they actually getting. So I looked at household incomes, which is what they're looking at basically to make those decisions. And for retired and non-retired households, and obviously the retired ones are still below. Of course, when you look at disposable incomes, you've got this travel to work and everything that David was talking about, which of course reduces it if you're still working. Plus, you have childcare and everything else. So it is a big issue, so it's really how you're going to have to decide how you calculate who is eligible and who isn't, and then you get into a complete and utter sort of huge bureaucracy that you develop on top of the dot, and the impact is going to be.
Yeah, it's, you know, in trying to address this affordability issue and selling it, you know, we really wanted to show that there are ways you could reform the tax system to make it pay for itself. I think that's the point we're trying to get at here. We've been joined by Michael Pugh, I think. Michael, hello, are you there?
Hey there, yeah, I'm here.
Sorry, I think we've just about wrapped up, I'm afraid. We started at 11, but I just...
No, I've actually been on the call for most of this time.
Okay.
Particularly without my camera or audio on. But I've listened with interest, and I'm looking forward, Alex, to us catching up in a couple of weeks' time.
No, I mean, ditto. I don't know if you had any passing thoughts at this stage, but...
No, I think there's been just the usual debate, I suppose, around universality and how you pay for it, all of which is interesting. But I think you're in the right space in terms of thinking about how do we sell it, and us at the basic income conversation, which is part of Compass. That's kind of what we're thinking about now. So thinking about, yes, these economic models are really interesting, but how do we actually how are public attitudes towards this idea, which are worth bearing in mind. So, but yeah, really interesting and a welcome addition to the field of research.
Well, thank you very much. Well, on that note, people, look, I mean, thanks for your contribution. I think it's been a very good debate, and it's been very helpful for us in terms of the feedback we've received. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you,
Alex.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thanks very much. Really interesting.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.